read and even met. Mikhail was right in residence here 10 years ago, as the history states, and it's wonderful that after this long hiatus and during this pretty terrible time, he found, let me sit because I can stabilize now. He found the time and opportunity to be with us. I believe, and I want just to express my admiration to Mikhail as one of the most prominent writers writing in Russian today and during the last, how many, 3 decades? No less than 3 decades, right? Indeed, it is 3 decades because the first novel was published in 1993, right? And Mikhail, I'll say a few words about the novels, the novels that made the name for Mikhail and his other publications. But it is very important, I think, for us that today Mikhail is one of the most articulated, strongest voices of the political opposition to Russia's regime and to the war in Europe, and he has been publishing against this war since, day one, literally in all possible venues, and he has been speaking for huge rallies in Europe. Rallies in the United States are significantly smaller, but I think that the quality of our rally can compensate for that. But what is important, everything is important, but it is very important that indeed Mikhail is one of those writers who, in his work, continues the tradition of Russian modernist literature. So we are used to lionizing of the great tradition of Russian novel of the 19th century, and frequently the great modernist literature of the 20th century is overshadowed by this huge monument. And Mikhail is the one who had connected contemporary literature with modernism, and with modernism beginning with Andrei Bely and up to the underground literature of the 70s and 80s. But while creating very complicated, very rich, culturally and intellectually rich texts, and his style is comparable with sometimes palimpsest, sometimes a carpet with multiple threads going into many directions. He, I think, was thinking politically since his earliest works, and it is amazing how his works written in the 90s, in the early 2000s, in the mid 2000s resonate with today's condition. Just a simple example: his first novel, "One Night Befalls Us All," "Omnes une manet noxt," based on the Latin phrase, it was read back then as a stylized novel that depicts the world and the life of the ordinary intelligentsia person in the 1830s, 1840s, 50s, etc. But the central moment in this novel is how Russian intelligentsia reacts to the uprising in Poland. And the conversations around this uprising sounded amazingly, or do sound now amazingly similar to discourses that are being in conflict today and have been in conflict around 1991. Mikhail's next novel was published in 1999, and it was the novel Taking of Ismail, and there he found his new form. I think the form that connects several, they might look fragmented realities, but indeed they create arcs, they create echoes, and the reality, mythological, and the reality of the very much confessional writing, they are deeply interwoven in that novel. And this technique reaches new level, and I think the most stunning quality in the novel Maidenhead, written in 2005 and translated into English in 2012. And this is the novel just to where on the one hand it begins with interviews that Mikhail's protagonist slash narrator is translating, interpreting with refugees, basically from Chechnya, from the war in Chechnya. Again, the resonance with today's reality is standing, and this was the novel that probably first addressed the huge presence of violence in Russian reality, and not only in the reality of the post-Soviet era, because a big chunk of this novel is a center. It's the very masterful combination of quotations from various sources spreading across, I think, 3 centuries, no less than 3 centuries. It goes back to Middle Ages and ends in the early 20th century, that are basically creating the Russian text. And this Russian text is the profound critique of Russian culture, very, I think, much more profound than what we frequently are encountering now in different contexts. So I want to take the time from Mikhail but I just want to mention his other books. His novel, the Letter Book, had been written in 2010 and translated in 2013, and also he wrote non-fictional books such as Russian Switzerland, 99. In 2000, and I haven't read this book, by the way, because Mikhail wrote it in German, Montre, Misuluk, Astapova, Tolstoy, I'm sorry, I cannot read my own writing. Doing something together with Byron and Tolstoy. Misha will correct me. Right, so what were they doing? Traveling, I guess. That's just my guess, because, as I said, I haven't read it in German. Misha also authors a book that exists only as a digital publication, and it's entitled Dead Souls, Living Noses, and Introduction into Russian Culture, also published in German, and as far as I know, awaiting its publication in English. Maybe this tour that Misha begins now will make it interesting for American, or at least Anglophonic, publishers. It is very, very important to know that although Mikhail has won all possible, or at least all major literary prizes in Russia, in 2013, so years matter, he published an open letter in which he sort of publicly withdrawn from the Russian presence at the Book Expo here in New York. And as a part of this letter, he wrote, a country where power has been seized by a corrupt criminal regime, where the state is a pyramid of thieves, where elections have become farce, where courts serve the authorities, not the law, where there are political prisoners, where state television has become a prostitute, where parks of impostors pass insane laws that are returning everyone to the Middle Ages. Such a country cannot be my Russia. So sort of little did we know, of course, but I emphasize that this letter and this statement, after which Mikhail's book stopped to be published in Russia, had been issued in 2013. We all know what happened after this and what happened in 2020 22, and reacting to what's going on today in Russia and with Russia and around Russia. Mikhail has written a new book, whose the title of which is this is the book. It was recently published in English by the UK press. The title is My Russia, War or Peace, and certainly it responds. It continues that quote that I just read. It cannot be my Russia. So that's my Russia that Mikhail speaks about, and he will be reading from this book today. Mikhail is the winner of multiple awards, and the latest one here my Italian comes handy, non-existing, of course, Premio Strega Europea in Italy for his latter book, which was translated into English and Italian as The Light and the Dark, and multiple other words. So I think it's time for me to stop and give the floor to Mikhail Shishkin. Misha, it's all yours.
Dear Mark, thank you very much for this great introduction. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you very much for having invited me. And yes, I will present this book. It has been released newly, so actually last week in London. And this book is very important for me. I tried to read a lot of books written by Russian experts last 20 years, and I was furious because people don't understand Russia at all, and they're Russian experts, and Western politicians listen to them. So thanks to these experts, now we are in this tragedy. And so this is my explanation of Russia and my explanation of this war. I explained through the history and through my personal family history. Actually, this book was written before this invasion started. I wrote it in German. And now I just wrote the introduction, the foreword, and the afterword. I changed a word in the book. And now the book is being more and more actual with every day. Last two chapters in German original called it is actually the German grammar tense, Futur 1, Futur 2, so future 1, future 2, and everything what is happening is going after the script, unfortunately. And I would like to read the introduction, a couple of sentences, and then a couple of pages, of course, and then a couple of pages from the middle of the book, so you could understand how the book is written. Maybe it's better.
And to add that this book has been already translated into several European languages and is on the top of the bestseller lists in Finland and Sweden, right?
Yeah, it has been translated, I think, in almost all languages, even in Japanese. Слушай, мы можем закрыть это, мне прям будет там. It hurts to be Russian. When Putin launched his special military operation in Ukraine, he claimed that its aim was to save the Russians, Russian culture, and the Russian language from Ukrainian fascists. In the process, it is predominantly the Russian-speaking cities in the east of the country, together with their populations, that have been wiped out. War crimes have been committed not only against people, but also against my language. The language of Alexander Pushkin and Leo Tolstoy, Marina Tsvetaeva and Joseph Brodsky has become the language of war criminals and murderers. For the foreseeable future, Russia will be associated not with Russian music and literature, but with bombs dropping on children and those terrible images from Bucha. Moreover, the regime's criminal actions taint the whole of the country. Monstrous crimes have been committed in the name of my people, my country, in my name. But there is another Russia. That other Russia is suffering pain and anguish. In the name of my Russia, in the name of my people, I would like to ask the Ukrainians for forgiveness. But I know that what has been happening in Ukraine is unforgivable. When my father was 18, he went to the war to avenge his brother's murder at the hands of the Germans. After the war, he spent the rest of his life hating the Germans and everything to do with the country. I told him, "But Dad, Germany has some great literature. German is a beautiful language." But my words had no effect on him. When this war is over, what will I be able to say to the Ukrainians whose houses have been bombed and plundered by Russian soldiers, whose relatives have been killed by Russian missiles, that Russian literature is wonderful and that Russian is such a beautiful language? When war starts, culture has failed. Great German literature couldn't avert Auschwitz. Great Russian literature couldn't prevent the Gulag. And my books and those of other Russian authors published in the past 20 years couldn't avert this tragedy. So what can writers do? They can do what they do best, make themselves heard. They must tell it like it is. If you say nothing, you are effectively supporting the aggressor and the war. In the 19th century, the Poles fought against Tsarist Russia for your and our freedom. And now the Ukrainians are fighting for your and our freedom. They are defending not only their human dignity, but the dignity of all humankind. Ukraine is defending our very freedom and dignity, and we must help in any way we can. My mother was Ukrainian, and my father was Russian. I can't help but be glad that they are not around to experience the tragedy that has hit our people. This war hasn't only just begun. It began in 2014, but the Western world refused to see it and acted as if things weren't all that bad. In the intervening years, I've kept trying to explain to people who this Putin is, in my writings as well as in my public appearances. It didn't work. Now Putin has explained it himself. These chapters were originally published in German in 2019. As relevant as they were then, they are becoming more so each day, and the future predict in the final chapters what lies in store for Russia and for the rest of the world has become our present. Back then, I wrote this. The glorious recovery of Crimea already has its own chapter in Russian school textbooks. And the next chapter waiting in the wings will tell the story of how Kiev crawled on its knees back into the arms of the Russian world, like the prodigal son. The Kremlin will keep stoking the conflict in Donbass. Putin will never give in. On 24th century, February 22, Russia's patience ran out. The Kremlin decided not to wait for Kiev to come crawling back on its own accord. Since that day, the world has become a different place. The West has woken up. It has expanded what I described as the half-baked sections that were in place in 2019 and banned or substantially banned Russian oil and gas imports. It has excluded Russian banks from SWIFT. In 2019, NATO was considering further expansion and thinking of admitting Finland and Sweden as a result of this year's event. The two countries are in fact close to joining. Finland is already, yes. Yet the West still finds Russia inexplicable and disconcerting. And the purpose of my book remains unchanged. I want to disclose my country to Western readers, to explain Russia and its past, present, and future. It is also a love letter to my country, which is blessed with stunning nature and wonderful culture, yet keeps turning into a monster that devours its own and other countries' children. The aim of Russia's special military operation is to destroy democratic Ukraine. The result of this special military operation will be the destruction of Putin's Russia. But what then? Two previous attempts to introduce democracy in Russia have both failed. The first Russian democracy of 1917 lasted only a few months. The one of the 1990s just managed to cling on for a few years. Each time my country tries to build a democratic society and to institute elections, a parliament, a republic, it finds itself back in a totalitarian empire. Again and again, Russian history bites its own tail. Do dictatorships and dictators give birth to an enslaved population? Or does an enslaved population give birth to dictatorships and dictators? How can the vicious circle be broken? Where can Russia make a fresh start? In Hitler's Germany, if Hitler's Germany was able to extricate itself from the vicious circle of dictatorship and slave mentality, why shouldn't Russia? The Germans have diligently studied the topics dealing with the past and processing guilt, and managed to create a democratic society. Yet Germany's rebirth was founded on its total Russian military defeat. Russia too needs its 0 hour. It cannot make a fresh start as a democracy without repentance and an acknowledgement of national guilt. Russia was never de-Stalinized, and there were no Nuremberg trials for the Communist Party. Russia's fate now depends on its deputinization. Just as in 1945, the Germans who didn't know were confronted with the concentration camps, the Russians who don't know have to be confronted with the ruined Ukrainian cities and the bodies of dead children. We Russians must openly and bravely acknowledge our guilt and ask for forgiveness. Every Russian has to go down this road. But will Russia get down on its knees in Kiev, Kharkov, Mariupol, or anywhere that Russian tanks have been, in Budapest, Prague, Tallinn, Vilnius, Riga, Grozny? In 1945, the Germans tried to justify themselves, arguing that, yes, Hitler was a vile and evil criminal, but they, the German people, didn't know anything about it, that they too were Hitler's victims. The moment the Russians use the same argument and claim that Putin's criminal gang took the people hostage, that he did wage a criminal war against Ukraine, But ordinary Russians didn't know that and thought it was about liberating the Ukrainians from fascists, that they too were Putin's victims. The moment this happens, deputinization will fail and a new Putin will be born. Neither NATO nor the Ukrainians can do the deputinizing for the Russians. The Russian people must clean up the country themselves. Are we up to the task? Is it realistic to expect constitutional democracies to form in those territories that will declare their independence from Moscow, since the disintegration of the Russian Empire isn't over yet? Yugoslavia showed how quickly a multinational state can descend into brutal war and genocide. And if violence escalates in Russia, it will set my country back centuries. For the West, this would mean a fresh wave of countless refugees. A new era of turmoil is on the horizon for Russia, where most people have lost faith in democratic ideas and are pinning their hopes on a strongman ruler. Such a strong man will no doubt be found, and the West too will understand and accept a new dictatorship of order. No one wants turmoil in a country that has lots of rusty nuclear missiles. This is my credo. There must be an acknowledgement of national guilt. Without complete deputinization, Russia has no future. A long and painful process of rebirth is its only option. And all those sanctions, the poverty, being ostracized, will be the least of Russia's worries. For Russian people not to undergo an inner rebirth, that would be far more terrible. Putin is a symptom, not the disease. It should now be the mission of Russian writers and artists to show the world that there is another Russia and that not all Russians support the war. This war isn't being waged between Ukrainians and Russians, but between human beings who speak both Ukrainian and Russian on the one hand, and inhuman beings who speak the language of lies and are willing to obey criminal orders on the other. In this war, then, there are no nationalities, only human beings and inhuman ones. The latter have no nationality because they are this criminal regime's slaves who beat up and arrest the humans who are taken to Russia's street to protest against the war. Putin's crime is that he has poisoned the people with hate. Putin will step down at some point, but the pain and hate will probably remain in their souls for a long time. Then it will be up to culture, to literature, and the arts to process the trauma. The day a dictator ends his miserable, unworthy life doesn't mark the end of culture. It never has and never will. There will be no need for books about Putin or books that explain the war. War, someone ordering the people of one nation to kill those of another, cannot be explained. True literature defies war. True literature is about our need for love, not hate. A reader once told me, "Your book prevented my love for Russia from suffocating in the blood of the Ukrainians." The Russian army's invasion of Ukraine has caused so much bloodshed. Can a book still prevent anyone's love for Russia from drowning in all that blood? After war comes anti-war literature. Just like Ernest Hemingway and Erich Maria Remarque once, I have no doubt that there will be young authors writing about their experiences in this war. Both Russians and Ukrainians will write books, and they'll be very different books. Both will write about the pain that loss brings, about death, about grief. But while Ukrainian literature will see books on the birth of a free country, the heroic resistance against evil, and the fight for human dignity, Russian authors will be preoccupied with acknowledgement of national guilt for the crimes that have been committed. Why are we Russians fascists? Hate is a disease. Culture is the cure. Thank you. And a couple of sentences from the chapter 8, Two Russian Peoples. I remember reading a famous fable in primary school in which an oak tree and a reed argue about who is stronger and more resilient. Every breath of wind moves you to and fro, says the oak dismissively. The reed doesn't reply. A little later, a violent storm draws in. The oak pushes against the storm and buckles. But the reed gives in to the gusts and survives unscathed. If you bend, you don't break. For us, they were nothing but words. But I now imagine that for our old teacher, they represented her personal experience of surviving in the 20th century Russia. Western observers had long remarked on the Russians' fatalism and infinitive forbearance, including the French diplomat Maurice Paléologue, who wrote, "One of the moral characteristics I'm always noticing in the Russians is the readiness with which they accept defeat and the resigned way in which they bow before the blows of fortune. Often enough, they do not even wait for the decrees of fate to be pronounced, but submit and adapt themselves accordingly by anticipation, so to speak." The submissiveness with which Russians endure their pitiful condition and oppression by the state, and which seems so strange to Western travelers, is the key component of the Russian survival strategy. If you bend, you don't break. Fear is a wellspring of life, and it comes as naturally as breathing or eating. It is part of our instinct for self-preservation. Anyone who sacrifices themselves for their principles is trying to defy nature. For the majority, it doesn't matter under whose flag the next Mongol attack arrives. They will adapt to any dictatorship. If their ancestors had not adapted to Batu Khan or to People's Commissar Dzerzhinsky, they would have survived neither the Tartars nor the communists. I was named after my grandfather, Mikhail Shishkin, who was arrested in 1930 during the Soviet Union's collectivization period. At the time, he was living with his wife and two sons, aged 9 and 4. The 4-year-old Pavel would become my father, in a village in the region of Tambov. The other peasants said nothing, but he protested. Why are you taking away our only cow? How am I meant to feed my 2 children? He was taken into custody, and my grandma never saw her Misha again. He later died in a Siberian prison camp. In her final years, Grandma started getting confused. She would say nothing that made no, she would say things that made no sense and lost her sense of time. Then her eyesight failed, and she spent her last years living in a small room in the home of her son, my father, where she would sit in the dark for days on end. I called her whenever I could and would yell into the phone so that she could hear me better. Babushka, hi, it's me, Misha. Misha? She would ask, startled. Who is this, Misha? She was probably reliving that day over and over, each time thinking anew that they were about to arrest her husband. She yelled into the phone, Misha, where are they taking you? Please don't. Let him go. What are you doing? I tried to interrupt her. Babushka, calm down. It's me, your Misha. But she wasn't listening. She kept yelling, trying to get her Misha away from them, trying to save him. Let him go. What did we ever do to you? Let him go, Misha, Misha. Back then, the people who said nothing survived. That's how natural selection works in Russia. Russian history has shown that generation after generation, the state would eliminate or drive into exile anyone who didn't fit in with the system. The others learned the Russian art of survival. If you tried to raise your head, you would be decapitated. So it was better for your health to say nothing and lick the boots of those in power. This is how the chief of police in Gogol's Dead Souls describes the interaction between the people and the state. Quotation. The chief of police observed that there was no need to be afraid of a mutiny, that there was a rural captain of police to see to it that it did not occur, and that even if the rural captain of police did not go there himself, but sent his cab, the sight of his cab alone would be sufficient to drive the peasants to their new places of residence. Like Gessler's hat in the legend of William Tell, the police captain's headgear symbolized the state authority, and the Russian peasants had more than enough reason to tremble before the captain's cab, just as the captain himself knew exactly why he trembled before the major's cab. And on it goes, up the social ladder until, trembling, you get to the monomarch's cab. The actual physical person plays no role in all that trembling. It is the superior rank itself that instills fear. And those at the very top, in turn, tremble before those who tremble before them. The source of Russian state power and of all law is violence, pure and simple. The state can do what it wants with us. The people are in the mercy of an occupying power. As Nadezhda Mandelstam, the widow of the murdered poet Osip Mandelstam, once described it, it's as if we were living on a sated ogre's kitchen shelf. The state is your destiny. Mere mortals cannot influence the system in the same way that you cannot choose your destiny. That is why the state is sacred, and why the Tsar, who symbolizes the state, is a sacred figure. In Anna Karenina, Levin asks a peasant, Have you heard about the war, Mikhailich? What do you think now? What we to fight for the Christians? Why should we bother our heads? Alexander Nikolaevich, our emperor, has thought about it for us, as he always does. He knows best. Why should we bother our heads? You aren't supposed to think, be it about war or whether they will tarmac your street. What you are supposed to do is submit and do as you are told. Thank you.
Now I think it's good time for Q&A. Right. Yeah, we will talk. We will take questions. I will begin, and I hope that others will begin.
I can talk.
You can talk without questions.
All my life long, I had a very solid ground under my feet, and that was Russian culture. And this last year, it was blown away, just blown away. And I realized what Kazimir Malevich meant with his black square. An artist has the feeling for the future. And in his future was the First World War, was the bloodiest civil war, and the Gulag. And now Russia is this black square again. 1 year ago, the whole world was just stunning. How is it possible? Just a few Russians go to streets to protest. How is it possible? It could be explained through this survival strategy, just keeping silent because people were afraid. Where are these few people who protested last year? They're in prison. And so it was just the survival strategy of generations. If you keep silent, nothing could happen to you. Yeah. It was formulated in the famous last sentence of historical drama by Pushkin, Boris Godunov. Yeah? Народ безмолвствует. People keep silent. But then came September, then came October, then came the mobilization. And we have seen how hundreds of thousands of people went to the war to kill Ukrainians and to be killed. You cannot explain this with the keeping silence strategy of survival. It's something deeper, it's something more horrible. What is it? We are in the 21st century, and we belong to the contemporary humankind, which had some development. And if I personally have the responsibility, so I personally have the responsibility for this decision, the main decision in the life, what is good, what is evil. And if I see that my people, my country make some evil, I will be against my country, I will be against my people. But the majority of Russians, they live mentally, psychologically in the past. They identify themselves with the tribe. Our tribe is always good. Other tribes are our enemies. They want to destroy us. They want to kill us. They are evil. And so we must just to defend ourselves. And we don't have any responsibility. We don't decide what is good, what is ill. We have our chief. We have our Tsar. He decides. He has the responsibility. And all dictators in all countries, they just misuse this feeling of patriotism. The wonderful feeling of loving your home country. And so it's like my father, yeah? Stalin killed his father, but when my father was 18, he went to the war because he wanted to defend his home country against fascism. In reality, he defended the regime which killed his father. All his life long, he was sure his comrades, they liberated Europe from fascism. He couldn't imagine that they brought to the liberated countries just another fascism. It was impossible for him to realize that he was a fascist. It's impossible. We are good. We were defeating the fascism. But now it's the same thing. These people are going to fight Ukrainian Nazism. They are going to fight NATO fascism. They are going to defend their home country against the fascists like the grandfathers did. This is the civilization gap. How can you make bridges? How can you explain to these people that they are fascists? It's very easy to say, like, it's like mistake, yeah, in the Western way of thinking about Russia. It was just because of the propaganda. Russians had to have the alternative sources of information, telling people the truth. But we had all these 20 years before this war started, before this invasion started. We had the alternative sources of information. We had Telekanal Dozhd, we had Echo Moskvы, and so on and so on. It was the free decision of these people to choose. They have here two kinds of truth. So imagine you have a son who was killed in Ukraine, a soldier, a Russian soldier, and you get one truth. Your son is a fascist. He went to Ukraine to destroy the new democracy. People wanted to go to Europe. They have European values. And your son is a fascist. He just destroyed houses, destroyed cities, killed people there. And you are the father of fascists. Shame on you. The other kind of truth. Your son is a hero. He went to Ukraine to defend us, our home country, our Russian language, Russian people, Russian culture. He went there to defend Pushkin and Tolstoy. He is a hero. And you are the father of a hero. You must be proud of him. What would be the truth for you? You see, it is like anti-Semitism in Germany. In every nation, there is some anti-Semitism, but this is the responsibility of the state to make the norm. In Germany, they made the anti-Semitism to the norm in the 30s. It was a law, yeah, Rassengesetze. And after the war, they made anti-Semitism outlaw. Yeah? It was laws against anti-Semitism. So in this way, the idea of the state is to make the norm, to change people. Yeah. And in Russia, every regime just tried to make people racists and fascists. And it is now the norm. So how to change this norm? We have to change the state. Is it possible? So this is the huge question. Is the democracy in Russia possible or not possible? But maybe the idea was just questions and answers, yeah.
So if you want to say something else, then we are happy to hear. But if you prefer that we would move to the dialogic regime, let's do it too.
Yeah, would be much easier for me.
All right, okay. Yes.
Спасибо, Михаил Павлович. Михаил Павлович, скажите, пожалуйста, вот русская... Oh, yes, of course. So there is an assumption, it's commonly said that Russian culture is beautiful and the names follow of artists and poets and etc. But then there is a consistent history of Russian leaders, educated tsars and uneducated ministers, governors of different kinds, communists or not, doing what they were doing consistently in 19th century with Poland that you described, and later Gulag, and later and later and now. Is it, and all those people were educated on the basis of Russian, beautiful Russian culture. Is it possible that there's something wrong with Russian, beautiful Russian culture? Is it possible that it's not that beautiful? Is it possible that we are making that assumptions and we blaming the state, so-called, when the state is really is a child of that culture?
Thank you very much for this question. Of course, everybody who has to do something with the Russian literature, with the Russian culture, asks him or herself the same questions. After we have seen in Bucha, yeah, what can we say about Russian culture? But we must say something, we must explain. And you see, it's impossible to blame Russian culture saying that these murderers made these crimes because they read Dostoevsky, because they read Tolstoy, because they read Pushkin. It's nonsense. They people who did this crime, they have never read books. It's a little bit complicated, this connection between the culture and the state. We must realize that the main enemy of Russian culture is the Russian state, has always been. The Russian state exists since Golden Horde, yeah? It's actually the same state. There was no Russian culture at that time. But we had already this pyramid, this violence pyramid, slaves and the Tsar, yeah? And then someday, yeah, they had to fight the West. But to fight the West, they need the cannons, they had military technologies. And they could just get it from the West to fight the West. And so that was the whole idea of changes made by Peter the Great. He just wanted to get the military technologies to fight the West. It was not about culture at all. He didn't need any culture. He needed the army. But you cannot just take the technologies without people. And so from Germany, from Europe, so came in the 18th century the Gastarbeiter, yeah, so-called. And these thousands and hundred thousands of people from the West, they came with their words. And in Russia, there were no such words. Yeah, it was 18th century. They brought literature, ideas, enlightenment, European values, democracy, republic. And so it took us centuries to develop this what we call now Russian culture. Yeah. In reality, it is just the Western culture which tried to exist in Russia. And the idea of the state was always to make people keeping silent. And the only what we could oppose to this silent is the word, is the culture. The only thing which was protesting by its existence against the state, against the regime, was the Russian culture. That is why all Russian poets, composers, artists, they were decapitated in the direct sense or in the indirect sense by the state, or had to emigrate. Why did the Russian state need the culture? Why did Stalin need Shostakovich? Not because he loved his music. He hated Shostakovich. He would be happy if Shostakovich would die in the Gulag. But we had, the Soviet Union had the West, and we had to show the West, look, we are great, we have culture. So that is why first you know the story. It was impossible, it was prohibited to play music by Shostakovich, and then they have to send some culture delegation to the United States. And so they need Shostakovich. So they started to play Shostakovich again, and Shostakovich went to the United States as a human face of the regime. Now they don't need culture at all. People of culture who are now in Russia, they must sing patriotic songs, or they must keep silent, or they must immigrate. So it is a little bit complicated to blame the Russian culture. Russian culture was the only thing which tried to oppose, to protest against the regime. I see it in this way. Of course, it was the tragedy, because Pushkin showed us how it works. He hated, of course, the tyranny as a young man. But then he started to understand Russia, how Russia works, reading the history. And he realized, if there will be no tyranny, there will be Pugachev uprisal. And the first thing in this freedom, would be the burned libraries. So in Russia, we have just two possibilities. We have this population which would burn your library, or we have the regime which just saves us from this uprisal. Of course, he hated regime hated Pushkin, and it was his tragedy to make this choice. Of course, he made this choice to be with the Tsar. But as a result, it was impossible. It was an impossible choice. So he was killed. It was something like suicide. So it shows us that that is not the victory of Russian culture being with the regime, but it's tragedy. Now we have again the situation like 100 years ago. The Russian culture is abroad, is an emigration. In Russia, culture is not more possible, because it's impossible to say free culture. Free culture is nonsense. Culture must be only free. And if a theater director just tries to save the theater and licks the boots of the regime, it's the end of the culture, it's the end of the art, it's the end of the theater. Is the Russian culture now possible in emigration or not? Now, this is a very actual question. In Russia, it's not possible to existing for Russian culture now. Is it possible here? 100 years ago, yeah, we saw it was possible just in the first generation. Bunin got the Nobel Prize. The second generation was already losing the culture. In the third generation, there was no Russian culture at all. Now we have the privilege, high technologies. 100 years ago, a literary circle somewhere in Harbin or somewhere in Anjetan, yeah, they felt so lost, so far away from the capitals of Russian culture in Berlin or in Paris. Now, if you are sitting in a train in Africa and you have Wi-Fi, you are in the middle of Russian culture. You are in the center of Russian culture. What will happen then with Russian culture, I don't know. Could the culture exist without the territory, without the supporting state or not? At the moment, I think it's blessing. Yeah, we are blessed now to lose this curse of territory. We are free now of that territory. What will happen then? It depends on us.
I have a somewhat different question, more historical, so to speak, because I believe that we went into the metaphysical areas, which are always dangerous. You were talking about the necessity of national guilt, and I understand that where this discourse is coming from, but haven't we been there already? And haven't what was called perestroika exactly about the national guilt, as you certainly remember, because we are same age, right? It's the first manifesto of perestroika was called Repentance, and the entire literature about Stalinism isn't this exactly what you are talking about in relation to the crimes committed now. And it seemed to be that it was sort of so massive, so profound, so deep that the political system collapsed, right? So weren't we happy and enthusiastic about this? And in 30 years, right, we are back to square one. So why do you believe? I understand that sort of speak about future, but we can speak about future only historically, right? Why do you believe that the repetition of the same cultural and social and even political procedures will not bring the same result as we are facing now? And certainly there was a big civilizational shift, right? So we all were talking about here there is a middle class in Russia, people who are traveling to, I don't know, Jamaica for their Christmas holidays, people who live in Europe more than they live elsewhere, right? So people who are the citizens of the world. And right, so many of these people voted by their legs when they were running away from mobilization and from the regime. And now we are talking about a million of Russian refugees. So of course, it's incomparable with how many people had to leave Ukraine, but nevertheless, it's a huge number of people who protested in a passive way, but they protested, of course. Yet it didn't change a thing. So what I understand that you are not a political analyst, but you said, and I'm reacting to what you said, right? What should or could be done differently, taking in consideration our experience of perestroika and following decades?
I'm talking all the time to myself. Yeah, it's my dialogue. And I wrote about this an essay. Maybe somebody read this essay. It was published on True Russia website. It calls Ruski Uroboros, where two guys, one is N, Latin N, he's like optimist. He's talking to Russian U, who is realist. And this is the endless Russian discourse about the possibility and impossibility of introducing democracy in Russia. And there are all arguments pro and all arguments against. So you could just find this in internet, Shishkin, Ruski Uroboros, you will find this. The problem begins already with the first word. You say, we.
I meant you and
You see, now all the words must have new definition. Русская культура, Russian culture, Russia, Russians, we, yeah. What do we mean? What do we mean by that? There are no Russians. There are two different nations who call themselves Russians. They speak the same language. They share the same territory. They used to share the same territory. Some of them still share the same territory. But mentally, psychologically, they are absolutely different. What are the main cursed, eternal Russian questions? Кто виноват? Что делать? Who is to blame? What is to be done? From the Russian 19th century literature. But these were main questions for the readers. And for 150 million peasants, they were analphabet. The main question was absolutely different. Is the Tsar fake or real? And they have the same main question till now. That's the only thing which matters. And you can prove is the Tsar fake or false or real just in one way. He must show the victorious war. He must show the victory. Then he will be real Tsar. And we have seen in the Russian history how it works. Stalin could kill millions and millions and millions. But for the population, for the majority of population, for the Russians, he was the real Tsar, beloved till now, because he could prove this with the great victory. Gorbachev, beloved in the West, lost the Afghanistan war, lost the Cold War against the West. Till he was a fake Tsar. Till now, people despise him. They hate him. Yeltsin realized absolutely that he must prove his legitimacy in only one way: small victorious war. His generals told him, in 3 hours, Grozny will be ours. We know what happened then. He lost the first Chechenian war. He was not a real Tsar. So the next one had to prove his legitimacy by the victory. And so we remember how Putin came to the power, exploding the houses to start the war. And it was not a war, it was genocide against Chechnya. Then he had to prove his legitimacy by taking the annexion of Crimea. Krym nash, Crimea is ours. And then he wanted to prove his legitimacy because he didn't do anything for Russians, for the population. Yeah, it was just against this glamorous, yeah, we are great again. Let's make Russia great again. And we know what happened, yeah, with this war. generals promised him to take Kiev in 3 days. We could be sure if Putin had known what would happen, he would never start this war. It's clear, yeah. But now he cannot stop this war. And to your question, I think it's impossible to introduce democracy in Russia. I'm very pessimistic. Why are you laughing? It's nothing. It's very sad. Because, of course, there were some mistakes made in the 90s, yeah? As said, no Nuremberg trials for the Communist Party, no de-Stalinization. Can you imagine in the 1945 the situation that the Gestapo people would be in charge for establishing democracy in the after-war Germany? It would be impossible. But in Russia, we had exactly communist people and KGB people who were in charge of establishing democracy in New Russia. What could they establish? The only thing they could establish, they established. And of course, we need this, our zero, yeah, for the new beginning. But the Germany state was destroyed. The Germany military machine was destroyed by the Allies. What will be the end of this war? It will be not the destroying of Russian military machine, yeah? We know how the war would end. Till the guy is in the Kremlin, the war will go on. But the first minute he's out of the game, we don't know how it will happen, yeah? Not just 3 possibilities: natural death, his friends will help him with the natural death, and he would flee, yeah, to the Central African Republic where he has his bunker. Just 3 possibilities. We don't know when it happens, but we know it happens one day. And it will be the end of the war for Ukraine, of course, because the war for the power, fighting for the power will start in Russia. And for these people who will fight each other to take the power, they will not care whom belongs Crimea or Donbass, yeah? Ukrainian will win the war. The whole world will help them to build up what was destroyed. And for Ukraine, I'm very optimistic. I wish them this victory. And they will build huge wall on the Russian border. But for Russians, it will be the black square, totally, yeah? Because to establish democracy, you need some conditions, yeah? One condition is, of course, this defeat, absolutely defeat, but there will be no absolutely defeat. There will be the same people everywhere. National guilt recognition. Who will make this? Yeah. In Germany, there were allies, there were Americans. Without Americans, there will be no national recognition of guilt in Germany. The main condition maybe is the critical mass of citizens. But the regime was clever enough to make the open borders for decades. We were grown up in a prison. It was impossible to escape because the regime needed the slaves. That criminal regime, which was established in the 90s, they didn't need people at all. They just sold oil and gas, and they didn't want to share the money with these scums. And they could learn from the mistakes of the Soviet regime. You remember Medvedev, when he was president, he said, everybody who is unhappy with us, just go. The borders are open, just go. And in the last 20 years, millions and millions of the citizens of eventual new beautiful Russia, прекрасная Россия будущего, they left because they haven't seen any future for them and for their children. And You see, I remember 2011, the so-called Snow White Revolution. I spent that year in Moscow. We rent an apartment. I went to all the demonstrations and meetings on Sakharova Prospect and so on. Yeah, there were hundreds, thousands of wonderful young people. They were the critical mass for the new democratic Russia. Where are they? They all left. They all left. So who will make the free elections in Russia? Kadyrov? Who will make the same? You know, in Russia, there's all elections were falsified by the teachers, and hundreds of thousands of schools, yeah, and the teachers had to make this crime. The same teachers, the same criminals would organize free, honest elections. Who will win these elections? Some foreign agent coming from London or Vilnius and saying, we will make democracy. People would say, no, 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 we have seen what democracy is in the 90s. All these ideas of democracy absolutely miscredit. People don't want again the democracy. Democracy. Yeah. And so, of course, if the really free elections will be won by the real patriots who maybe fought against Ukrainian Nazis, people like Strelkov and so on. Of course, they will win, and people like Kasparov and Khodorkovsky will lose. We all understand this. They have no chances. Of course, we'll see the disintegration of the last empire. Now the Russian Federation is pregnant with new states like the Soviet Union was. First of all, national republics will go into the independence, yeah? Like Northern Caucasus and Tatarstan, Yakutia, and so on. Will these new states be democratic? Of course not. There will be chaos and anarchy, and we all have seen how dictatorship comes. Yeah, it's not with a dictator. It's impossible to imagine. So I live in Switzerland. It's impossible to imagine that a guy will come to burn to the Bundeshaus square and say, "Swiss people, I'm now your dictator. Listen to me." What will he hear? Fuck off. Huh? That will be the end of. I hope the same thing would be in United States, but who knows? But dictatorship starts with the longing for the order in the 20s in Germany, in the 90s in Russia. It's impossible to live in the chaos and anarchy. So people were longing for the strong hand to establish the order. And of course, there will be a lot of such strong hands. And they will have to prove their legitimacy, not with the elections. Nobody believes in elections, but with the victorious war. So they will fight each other, and the guy who will be, one of them will be the Tsar, the new one, the new Putin. Or there will be several new Putins. And the sad thing for me is that the West will make handshake with these new Putins because they will promise to take control over the nuclear weapons. And the Russian history will bite its tail again. I'm sorry, I'm not optimistic for Russia.
Yeah, please. Let's go here, this way.
Thank you, Mikhail. My name is Margarita. I have two questions. Like the first one is about your thesis about culture. I find it interesting. like you said, there is no culture left. And like state is the enemy of Russian culture, which is for me a bit puzzling because like just statistically in comparison to other countries, including this one, the state support share in Russia is bigger than in the US, UK, and so on. So when you say like state is the enemy of culture, I need more explanation. And also like maybe there is something in particular you mean by culture when you say there's no culture left, because well, I research cultural production in Russia, and there are so many initiatives pro-war, against war, ignoring the war, writing between the lines, and so on. Like, what do you mean by culture? This simple question. And the second one is actually about your personal understanding of war, about the process, because like, thanks for sharing, and I feel like you have a theory what's going on. Is there any other questions like you still asking yourself, or something you find confusing or puzzling? Yeah, I would be very curious to know. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these questions, which are embarrassing actually for me. The first one, you need the proofs that the Russian state is the main enemy of the culture. Did I understand you correctly? Do you really think that Putin needs culture?
I don't say they're not accountable for control, but they are there. So
Do you have personal connections to Russian cultural institutions? And they feel free? You answered your questions. They are slaves. They are slaves of the state. When the Crimean annexion, after the Crimea was annexed, every director of every culture institution had to sign the letter. It's wonderful. I vote for this, for the war. After this invasion, all the directors of all the museums and so on had to sign, I support this war. They're all war criminals. They were made to war criminals by the state. And for you, it's okay, yeah? For me, if director of a theater, of a museum, of a literary archive signs such paper, it means he's a traitor of culture. He lost his dignity. Culture is dignity. To work for culture is dignity. And signing such papers, you're making yourself to the war criminal. You lose your dignity. Okay, you make money, you get money for this. Will you be happy with this dirty money? Supporting this dirty war? Taking money for the dead children in Ukraine and saying, oh yeah, I'm museum director. It doesn't work in this way. It doesn't work in this way if you want to preserve your human dignity. And as a cultural worker, you must have this dignity. If you just take money and close eyes and support what is happening in Russia, it's better for the art, for the theater, for the museum that you go, that you disappear. It was the first question. The second question about, so my personal engagement, yeah, it was. You said in your introduction that from the very first day I was fighting. I was fighting for decades to explaining to people in the West that's impossible. It's impossible to support Putin. It was impossible. It was something like appeasement policy. But who listens to writers? 2013, I tried to organize in Switzerland the boycott of Olympic Games. I was in the media. Who listens to writers? Yeah. How I tried to explain to people, you want to make bridges. To whom do you want to make bridges? Do you want to show solidarity with the dictator who took hostages the whole country? What to the hostages? Swiss people, like other nations, yeah, they built the Swiss chalet in Sochi, and the Bundespräsident of the first and best democracy in Europe, he personally licked boots of the president, Putin, and as a result, almost the next day after the Olympics, this war started. This war started by the annexation of the Crimea. 4 years passed, 2018, soccer championship, world championship in Russia. The story repeated. I tried to organize boycott. I was on main newspapers in Switzerland. I was on TV. Here, yeah, here, moral things, and here billions and billions of money, of soccer money, and fun. All nations went to Russia to play football in front of Putin. He understood it absolutely incorrect way. We all, the whole world, supports his war. And the door to the 24th February 22 was open. Then, 2018. So for me, it was like shouting in the emptiness. And then 24th of February, this invasion started. And what I hear from our Bundespräsident, he said, we are neutral. We will not support the sanctions against Russia. I was so furious, like what I have done all the years, it was in vain, yeah? On the 25th of February, next day, I was in the Arena at his main TV political show. I can't remember what I was talking, but apparently, you see, these were my 5 kopecks, because on the next day, Bundespräsident changed his mind and said, yes, we will support the sanctions against Russia. It was like my personal small victory against the war, against Putin regime. And then there were a wave. You don't have this here. It was a huge wave of refugees in the first months. A family from Odessa lived with us the first months. Now they got an apartment near Zurich. In every community and in every village, there were refugees, women and with children. And so every community made something like welcome meeting. They invited people from the village and Ukrainian refugees. And for me, it was very important to take part, to speak to these people. I will never forget my first disengagement with them. It was in a small village near Basel. No, such a venue, a lot of people, lots of Swiss people, and here are sitting Ukrainian women. And they hear a Russian writer would talk to them. They have never heard my name. They have never read my texts, but I'm Russian. It was such hatred, yeah, in their eyes, yeah. And I'm standing in front of them, and they lost their houses, they lost their beloved people, yeah, and I'm Russian. And for me, it was so important to talk to them. And I talked to them, and I saw how they changed. Because for them, I saved what was important for them before. I saved for them Russia, I saved for them Russian culture. So I'm not a murderer, there are other Russians. And so at the end, I saw the love and tears in their eyes. The applaud, they didn't want me to go. And it took me so much pain, energy, yeah, to speak to them, because I felt guilty for everything. I took this guilt. But it was very painful for me to participate in such meetings, but I did it. It's my message now to the whole world. I was just defending my language. This war took my language away, yeah? My language lost its dignity. So I'm fighting to regain the dignity to Russian language. But I will not give up. Maybe it will have no sense at all, but it's the only thing I could do. I think everyone must do what he or she can. That is what I do, and I will do.
It's recording.
Thank you for your words tonight and for sharing your experiences. I wonder, the time of war is a time of when it's difficult to write novels. We hear this from different corners, that there's a lot of unprocessed emotions and experiences right now. So it's the time of short genres, of more political engagement. What are you working on right now?
Yes, thank you for this question. For me, it's absolutely impossible to write a novel about great eternal love when I'm every day, every 3 minutes, I watch different Telegram channels, what is happening there. You see, now in the 21st century with these high technologies, it's impossible to be far away from the war. You see how people are killed, yeah, just live. I cannot imagine that people could write now novels. Who needs novels now? But if they write, maybe it's important for them. Maybe it's writing novels about eternal love is now for them. They're fighting the situation. They're fighting for preserving themselves. This I understand, but not for me. I write a lot, but I make interviews, I write essays. Maybe one day, yeah, but it's not depends on me. It depends on the novel. The novel must come. Who knows? But not now, for sure, not now.
I think we have time for one last question. No?
As I told you, I wrote this novel for the Western reader. because I saw how people now want to understand and they cannot understand because they read such books which so the author cannot understand what is happening and why. Yeah, and I don't think this book should be translated into Russian, because in Russian we have quite different situation. People in the West, they don't understand and they want to understand. In Russia, we have civil war, we have front line. People who stand with me in this fighting, in this war, they can understand. I don't need to explain to them what is happening and why. And people on the other side of the front line, they would never read Shishkin. Yeah. Thank you very much, but
We found it. Thank you so much, Misha. Thank you.